What was it that I said that caused such a fuss? And that fuss is just beginning.
Whether you like it or not, Dr. Jordan Peterson is one of the most important intellectuals in the world right now. He is an author, scholar, and a psychologist. Jordan Peterson is well known for his helpful and popular online lectures. Many of them are on topic of religion.
You never think anything like that could possibly be popular.
His work in psychology makes him very efficient at helping people. He published a book, 12 Rules for Life, an antidote to chaos.
Clean up your room. That's a good start. Organize your local landscape.
I'll go through the rules first. So rule 1 is stand up straight with your shoulders back. And rule 2 is treat yourself like you're someone responsible for helping. And number 3, which is very tightly associated with number 2, they're sort of variations on a theme, is make friends with those people who want the best for you. Rule 10 is be precise in your speech. So that's the nature of the world. Order, chaos, and order. And your goal is to keep the relationship between those two things optimized. And you do that by doing what's meaningful, not what's expedient. That's rule 6. And you ensure that you have the world construed properly by following rule number 8, which is tell the truth, or at least don't lie. Rule 7 is do what is meaningful and not what is expedient. And I would say in some sense that's the core ethos of the book.
Peterson primarily studies religion because it provides a hierarchy of values, a narrative structure, and is an antidote to nihilism, in a sense of the word used by Nietzsche.
People think, especially when they're nihilistic and they become destructive, that the universe is it's an unfair and arbitrary place, and it's basically bent on their random destruction while they suffer. It's something like that. Yeah, right. Okay, what do you do under those circumstances? That's the question. Well, one potential answer is twist the thing so that you can maybe get what you hypothetically want out of it. The other is rely on your perceptions and your capacity for accurate representation, communicate that, and take your chances. It's like, who's right? Well, that's the battle between good and evil. Who's right? It's a continual battle.
For his philosophy, he uses his own terminology coming from study of psychology, science, and religion. For example, I agree with Dr. Peterson that hierarchy must be based on competence, and that freedom requires responsibility. The problem I have, and where I disagree with Dr. Peterson, is definition of reality and truth, importance of religion before science, and attention before reason. Jordan Peterson uses various definitions of truth.
So now then you ask yourself, well, how do you determine whether or not a theory is true? Then you ask yourself, well, what do you mean by true? Well, then you're in trouble. Okay, because I think you can take a Newtonian perspective on that, or a Darwinian perspective, but you can't do both at the same time. Yeah? Okay. So Nietzsche said truth serves life. Okay, in some sense that's a Darwinian idea, okay? If it's true enough so that if you act it out or hold it, that increases your chances of survival and reproduction over long spans of time, that's true.
Darwinian truth is different from the Newtonian truth, which represents a 17th century science and reason-based truth about material reality. Also, Peterson argues that material truth can be a detriment to humanity.
We have no idea if our detailed knowledge about the material world is going to be the type of knowledge that allows us to survive and reproduce over a long period of time. It's not been tested from a Darwinian perspective at all. And you might say, well, of course the materialist perspective is right. Look what we've built with it. We've built hydrogen bombs, for example. But then you might object to that by saying, well, yeah, we've built hydrogen bombs, but the only reason we could build them, or were willing to, was because we left things out of the equation. Well, what things? Well, things like, is it really a good idea to build hydrogen bombs for example.
Modern people, we think of reality as objective, and that's very powerful. But that isn't how we experience reality. We have our domain of experience, and this is a hard thing to get a grip on, even though it should be the most obvious thing. For the phenomenologists, everything that you experience is real.
For a scientist, everything you experience is also real as well. It is just very difficult to study. It is difficult to write it down, even on a computer, and then solve the problem. At least for now, because quantum computers will potentially be able to, at least in principle. For example, a quantum computer with only 270 bits has more possible configurations than the number of all atoms and elementary particles in the universe. IBM had already released a 1000-qubit quantum processor, but it is more of a prototype than a perfect working model. Soon, using quantum computers, it will be possible to simulate complex chemical reactions and even biology.
Rational, well, it's got to make sense, because the more restrictions on your theory, the better. And so I want it all laid out causally so that B follows A and B precedes C, and in a way that's understandable and doesn't require any unnecessary leap of faith.
For someone who requires theory to be causal, he certainly has no problem abandoning causality and reason when religion is the topic of discussion.
That's like Kierkegaard's leap of faith. You cannot tell if this works unless you do it.
According to Albert Camus, intellectuals can be categorized as the ones who are rational and agnostic about certain ideas, such as religion, and the ones who demand a leap of faith where reason fails. Prime example is Kierkegaard. Dr. Peterson defines his own original category of an intellectual. When reaching the limit of reason, redefine concepts of truth, reality, religion, and even God, and then proceed to define your philosophy with new definitions that are unfortunately ambiguous to anyone who does not understand the redefined concepts well.
There weren't any scientists back then. There's hardly any scientists now. It's hard to think scientifically, man. It's like it takes a lot of training, and even scientists don't think scientifically once you get them out of the lab, and hardly even when they're in the lab. You got to get peer reviewed and criticized, and it's hard to think scientifically. So, and however the people who wrote these stories thought was more like dramatists think, more like Shakespeare thought, but that doesn't mean that there isn't truth in it. It just means that you have to be a little bit more sophisticated about your ideas of truth.
Yes, science is difficult, but I can still try to explain how it works in practice.
Right, so that's the problem with modern scientists. It's like, are you Newtonian or are you Darwinian? It's like Newton, he's wrong, by the way. Right, we already know that because Newton's only a subset of Einstein, let's say. And God only knows what the whole quantum thing is going to end up being. We don't even know how to structure our thought in accordance with those presuppositions.
Yes, we do. Quantum theory is the ultimate theory of nature and can be used to define a modern science view of truth. It is based on principles of quantum theory, stating all observable physical quantities in nature that in principle can be measured can only be known with a certain probability. On the right is an example of a probability function for an electron in a hydrogen atom. For an experiment or observation of a natural phenomenon, a high statistical probability of detection is required to claim success. For example, Higgs boson discovery at Large Hadron Collider at CERN was declared to be a reality when it was determined statistically with 99.9999% probability that Higgs boson was observed. It was not enough. There were two independent experiments called ATLAS and CMS, and after both of them confirmed with 99.9999% the same discovery, the Nobel Prize was awarded.
Because that's another thing that I think interferes with our relationship with a collection of books like the Bible, is that you're called upon to believe things that no one can believe.
And that's no good, because that's a form of lie as far as I can tell. And then, well, then you have to scrap the whole thing, because in principle the whole thing's about truth. And if you have to start your pursuit of truth by swallowing a bunch of lies, then how in the world are you going to get anywhere with that?
Trying to construct the definition of truth or religion based on Darwinism, biology, or psychology does not work entirely. Peterson tries to support his ideas with science, but fails ultimately, and then again a leap of faith is required. Although he claims that his view of religion is scientific, he even does not understand his own belief in God.
And so what you have in the figure of Christ is an actual person who actually lived, plus a myth, and in some sense Christ is the union of those two things. The problem is I probably believe that, but I don't know. I'm amazed at my own belief, and I don't understand it.
I do not believe Dr. Peterson is being deliberately contradictory or obscure. I think he is generally trying to define his own religion and support it with science and philosophy.
So is this the sense in which these religious or mythological stories and images are true?
Yeah.
In the sense that they instruct action in a way that, in the Darwinian sense, is true.
Right, and that's the only sense in which truth exists. Well, if you're Darwinian.
Jordan Peterson is allowed to define his own version of truth, religion, or reality. The problem is how he uses the concept of truth, or if it is useful.
Then you get back into the problem of what constitutes truth. Is it useful?
Using new definitions introduces confusion in the discussion. Even if not deliberately, he is obfuscating the reality of the conversation.
So then the question is, what attitude towards religion is truly scientific? Right. I think my attitude towards religion is precisely scientific. So, because it's predicated on Darwinian, really on Darwinian presuppositions. Dawkins is a rationalist. He's not a Darwinian. He just thinks he's a Darwinian.
As a consequence, according to his definitions, Richard Dawkins is not Darwinian.
Dawkins has Darwinism painted on Enlightenment rationality. He's an Enlightenment guy. It's like rationality rules. It's like, this is how you make sense of the world. It's like, okay, well, we've thought that more or less for 400 years. So what did we think for the other, 300 million years? How did we manage without that, if it's truth? So it's a form of truth. It's a partial form of truth, and it's a powerful partial form of truth. But to say it's truth, well, then it depends on what you mean by truth. So, yeah, well, and that's where it gets back, and that's where it starts to go back into the Darwinian issue, which is there's only one way you can define truth in relationship to finite beings. It's true enough. True enough for what? True enough so that you survive and reproduce.
The Catholic Church had been distorting the original proposition that Earth was created by God many times throughout history. When it was first revealed that Earth is not at the center of the solar system, an idea known as the Copernicus principle, the Church with reluctance had to change their original stance based on the Bible, but not before destroying lives of Galileo and Copernicus. After Darwin, the Church had to revise the age of the planet Earth and the origin of human species. In the 20th century, the physics and cosmology evolved, and the application of the Bible has suffered further setbacks. Famously, Pope John Paul, at the 1982 conference in Vatican, told Stephen Hawking that he should study the universe only after the Big Bang, but not the Big Bang itself, because the beginning of time is work of God. So the application of the Bible as the most credible source of knowledge about our universe had been reduced from the entire existence of the universe to just a moment of Big Bang. Peterson tries to restore credibility of religion by use of theory of Darwin as a theory of evolution.
What I think about religion is a very Darwinian. I think religion is evolved knowledge. And it's knowledge about action. And the world is made out of action. So especially the human world. And so you can't say, well, that's not real. It's like, that's wrong. It's real. It's not something you can easily reduce to causal relationships between the fundamental building blocks of matter.
Everything can be reduced to interactions between fundamental blocks of matter. Only it is impossible in practice to study or solve entirely. So we resort to approximations of natural science, such as ethics or psychology. While it might be true that the world is too complicated such that all moral and ethical problems cannot be studied or answered with science, science is constantly advancing. If scientists throughout history had accepted that science or material reality is superseded by what is written in the Bible or any other religious scripture as the ultimate truth, would there be a principle of relativity, quantum theory, modern physics, or modern technology?
As soon as Darwin published The Origin of Species, they recognized that the theory of evolution was pragmatic. They got it like right now. They were very excited about it. So, and they got excited about it because the Darwinian claim is things are always true enough, and that's it. And it isn't in some sense even because you lack knowledge. It's because you couldn't have the knowledge, even hypothetically, without running a simulation as complicated as the world itself. And even then it wouldn't turn out the same way.
Is this like a Gödelian view of reality, in the sense that any explanation of the complexity of a system is doomed to be simpler than the system it's trying to explain?
Yes, that's one way of thinking about it. Sure, sure. Well, you could think about it as, that's right, you can think about it as a limitation of the perceiver. The problem too is that whatever knowledge you accrue about the system changes the system. It's like trying to predict the stock market, which isn't possible, right? So I think that's a really good example, actually. And try to predict the stock market rationally. See how you do. Well, you might say, well, it's not real. It's like, okay, well, we don't agree about what constitutes real. So we could have that discussion.
Methods developed for physics problems have been adopted for financial markets. And the stock market could be studied mathematically with differential equations or machine learning methods from which statistical results can be obtained. The same way as for physics and quantum theory, probability for properties of a certain stock can be calculated, and is very real as problems in physics. More advanced artificial intelligence methods are being used now.
But I want to tell you a little bit about Genesis, because I think there are things in it that are, well, they're what make the self-evident, but I also think that they're also true. They're true metaphorically, for sure. They're true psychologically, I believe, and they might be true metaphysically, but I don't know, because no one knows about that. And that's where when you're speaking of ultimate things, your knowledge runs out. And so, but I'll stick to the metaphorical and the psychological. That'll do, So the way Genesis is structured, it's quite interesting. There's 3 elements that are discussed as constituting the being. It's not a theory of material existence like a scientific theory. It's not that. It's a theory of being. So and that's a hard thing to understand in itself. You could think about it as a theory of the structure of experience. That's another way of thinking about it. You have experience of the world, and you have your emotions and your motivations, and you have your aims and your stories and your thoughts. There's a characteristic human mode of existence. It's conscious. We're aware that things exist, and we live within that structure. And as far as I can tell, given that Genesis is certainly not a scientific account of the structure of the universe, it has to be some account of something else, and it's an account of experience itself, and maybe experience itself is the ultimate reality, and it depends to some degree on how you define ultimate. It depends also on how you define reality.
Peterson, not in spite of trying, has problems defining reality.
So there's no doubt that empirical science has kicked the slats out of the way people think about religion. Because it wasn't easy for people to understand that there could be different systems of thought might have different purposes. You have to be a philosopher of thought to think about that even. And I don't think that became obvious at all until after Nietzsche. Not all belief systems serve the same masters, so to speak. And so you can't assume that every system of thought is doing the same thing. And then you can't assume also that there's only one way to formulate your basic assumptions about the nature of reality.
Peterson, not by lack of trying, has problems defining reality. Metaphysical problems, such as what is reality, are futile and cannot be answered through philosophical arguments, as there can be no consensus between subjective observers with imperfect senses. Since you cannot verify your theory of reality and compare it to any solid experimental data, you cannot clearly define a reality. A useful definition of what is real should include a consideration that what is real for one individual must be real also for other observers. Otherwise, by definition, should be not real. What is important is what definition of real or truth is the most useful for a certain problem. Stephen Hawking shared similar beliefs and claimed philosophers have not kept up with modern developments in science.
No other creature has science. It's like they did perfectly well without it. Maybe science is fatal. I mean, it could easily be fatal. So, you know, and someone who's a scientist in the sort of ideological sense would say, well, even if it's fatal, it was still true. It's like, well, it depends on how you define truth. Like, if you're willing to say that fatal is true, well, then go ahead. But I think that's not a good definition of truth. And that's where our disagreement really lies. You have your definition, and I have my definition. I think my definition is Darwinian. So you have to contend with that if you're a scientist. But you might dispute that, although it's not clear to me how you would dispute that.
But for most people, I think, when they hear the word truth, especially people in academia or people who are involved in the sciences in any way, they think of something very different.
Yes, of course.
And
their truth is representational.
right. So
Yeah.
can you elaborate maybe on this?
See, that's also partly why the Catholic Church historically has been so put off by the rational intellect. You know, like people like Dawkins say, well, you know, yeah, they went after Galileo because he was undermining their superstitions.
Galileo was also developing a theory of relativity. Its importance will be explained in detail.
It's like, yeah, partly right. The other part was Seth, like the figure of evil throughout history, is always the hyper-rational intellect.
How did Galileo represent the totalitarian rational intellect?
Seth, like the figure of evil throughout history, is always the hyper-rational intellect. And the reason for that is the intellect is God's highest angel, so that's Lucifer, and it falls in love with its own creations. It likes to make totalities out of its own creation. Once there's a totality, there's no room for the transcendent. There's no God. That's Satan's error, by the way. And everything immediately turns into hell.
In his quest to define reality, by accident, Peterson had used a perfect historical example. The Roman Inquisition in 17th century concluded that Copernican heliocentrism and ideas by Galileo were foolish, absurd, and heretical, since it contradicted Holy Scripture, although the ideas were supported by data provided by Galileo. In name of religion, Galileo had been declared a heretic. He had to formally denounce his ideas, and if he had ever said he believed in heliocentrism after denying, he would have been liable to receive an automatic death sentence. Pope John Paul and the Church formally acquitted Galileo only 370 years later. Galileo's greatest achievement was development of principle of relativity, which states that laws of nature should be the same in every inertial frame of reference. It was the start of a revolution in physics that by 20th century eventually properly described physical reality. For all practical purposes, for problems in natural sciences, at least. Every observer can define its own frame of reference and a coordinate system centered on every individual. One observer can define a coordinate system with its origin at center of mass, and another observer moving away with a certain velocity can also define his own coordinate system the same way. Different observers moving away with a certain velocity define their coordinate system in their own frame of reference. The problem is, how do you change the location, rotation, or the speed of the coordinate system so you can compare the results from different observers? One can try to perform a mathematical transformation from one to another coordinate system so that the outcome of physical measurements performed by different observers can be compared, and then determine whether they belong to the same reality and whether laws of nature are the same for every observer. Galileo tried to develop the transformations which made possible for the first time a proper description of reality. Modern physics is based on a fundamental principle where reality and the outcome of physical experiment is independent of the method, observer, and coordinate system used to describe the experiment. Once Einstein included gravity and the ultimate velocity, the speed of light c, theory of special and general relativity had been invented. As a consequence, space-time can have curvature and expand. For example, the whole universe is expanding. Equations of general relativity have built-in properties that allow transformations of the coordinate system while describing the same reality, independent of which observer is using the equations in their own frame of reference. As an example, observer in a galaxy far away, moving away from us with almost the speed of light, can use the same equations of general relativity to calculate and observe a spaceship traveling from our galaxy towards the other galaxy and make the same conclusions about the reality and properties of the spaceship, such as velocity, position, or material composition of the spaceship. If mathematical results are in accordance with observations, they can agree on what is real or not. In principle, it is possible to achieve the same with every experiment or observation that we can declare as reality. By use of mathematics as a language of nature, what was impossible for philosophy is possible for physics. What can be defined as a physical reality is only limited by technology.
So, and there's lots of other things that work better than thinking. Paying attention is better than thinking. It's much better than thinking. Paying attention allows you to listen to people who don't agree with you. Paying attention allows you to learn things that you don't already know. So, you know, if it's thinking or attention that should be the God, it's like attention rules. Thinking, that's a subordinate phenomena.
Why remove reason from the highest position? How does attention trump thinking? If you are paying attention during reading of a certain book, are you supposed to take everything as is, without discerning what is right and what is wrong? How are you going to learn anything if you did not understand the presented ideas and rationalize them?
It's like attention rules. Thinking, that's a subordinate phenomena, but it likes to pop up on top, you know, because it likes its little tight theories and it likes to be right. Well, you know, forget that. You're not going to be right.
Are we supposed to conclude that rational theories such as general relativity and quantum theory are not right because they are not a direct product of attention? What happened to Galileo is a perfect example how removing reason from the first place in order is a bad idea. Imagine if every physicist or philosopher had the same view on objective truth and had been an existentialist as Kierkegaard. Would theory of relativity or quantum theory have been invented? Imagine if Galileo abandoned his work on the principle of relativity because he represented some kind of a totalitarian, rational, hyper-intellect. Here's another quote by Dr. Peterson. Meaning is not a rational phenomenon. We detect it with our being, not by intellect. Quantum theory is not only the greatest science achievement ever, but also the most accurate theory in human history. Further, quantum theory is completely at odds with classical science and philosophy. Years of study and reasoning is required until you can understand its meaning. Ultimately, I claim that science and reason can be a better source of meaning.